Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to wait just a few minutes to let others join, then we'll begin today's discussion, probably more like a minute or so we will jump right in. All right, not sure if that was a full minute, but we will go ahead and get started here. So good afternoon again, and welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders, building robust summer development opportunities for the special education workforce. My name is Madeline Smith, and I am the Director of Higher Education here at the Hunt Institute. For those of you unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term governor, North Carolina Governor, Jim Hunt, and we serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum through in-person and virtual convenings, as well as research and other forms of technical assistance. Before getting today's conversation started, I wanted to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start the discussion with about a 30-minute moderated discussion. We'll then move to our panelists. The panelists will engage in that discussion, then we'll pivot to a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the discussion. Additionally, we will record this conversation and post it on our YouTube channel for folks to view afterwards. For those attending today's discussion, we also encourage you to share the conversation on social media using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. All right, so one more note as well. I also want to thank the Educating All Learners Alliance for their partnership in hosting this webinar. EALA is an alliance of organizations that represent voices from a diverse range of communities, including disability advocacy, parent, special education, civil rights, and K-12 nonprofit education organizations. They are committed to resource sharing and community building that supports the efforts of the education community to meet the needs of students with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. So thank you so much to EALA. So let's get started. It is no surprise that the COVID-19 pandemic upended traditional K-12 learning and instruction for all education stakeholders, students, teachers, and administrators included. The pandemic also highlighted the greatest areas of need, especially for students with disabilities and their teachers. Some students with disabilities lost the additional supports and services they required to access the curriculum during virtual learning, putting them behind educationally, academically, I should say, as schools return to in-person learning. As special educators prepare for the new school year, they will need rigorous professional development to support them in meeting the needs of students with disabilities as we move into that new academic year. So today we will be hearing from professionals who understand the policy intricacies and current research trends around the needs of special education students and their teachers. Those voices are of Commissioner Angelica Infante-Green, Sarah Berger-Sendelius, and Dr. Amelia Malone. So welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for joining us today. So Commissioner, I want to provide a brief introduction of all three of our distinguished guests today. So Commissioner Angelica Infante-Green has served as the Rhode Island Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education since April 2019. As Commissioner, she has instituted several major efforts to improve K-12 education across the state. In the midst of the pandemic, the Commissioner convened the Learning, Equity, and Accelerated Pathways, otherwise known as LEAP Task Force, which released its report and recommendations to help guide accelerated learning opportunities to rebuild Rhode Island's educational system post-pandemic. Prior to joining RIDE, she served as the Deputy Commissioner of the New York State Education Department's Office of Instructional Support, serving multilingual learners and students with disabilities. Commissioner Infante-Green began her career as a bilingual classroom teacher in the South Bronx, and she was a member of the first cohort of the Chiefs for Change Futures Chief program. Infante-Green also earned an MA in Education and in School Administration and Supervision, from Mercy College. So welcome, Commissioner. Right. Sarah Sendelius is the founder and CEO of the Ability Challenge. Sarah has over 15 years of experience driving education, law, and policy on behalf of our nation's young people, focusing on the most vulnerable populations, including disconnected youth and students with disabilities. In founding the Ability Challenge, Sarah aims to solve the opportunity gap between students with disabilities and their general education peers by working with schools and other nonprofits to create robust environments that are truly responsive to the needs of diverse learners. She also currently runs Flip Turn Educational Consulting, a firm that advises on strategic projects pertaining to special education, correctional education and juvenile justice, privacy and information sharing, interagency collaboration, and discipline in schools. Thanks so much for being here, Sarah. And last but not least, we have Dr. Amelia Malone, the current Director of Research and Innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Amelia is an experienced researcher and works collaboratively to identify effective solutions for improving student achievement. Her research contributions include developing effective instructional methods for students with learning disabilities, identifying the cognitive and linguistic correlates of mathematics development and responsiveness to instruction, advancing best practices for models of prevention and intervention, and translating research into practical and approachable implementation. So thank you, Dr. Malone, and again, thank you all for being here with us today. Looking forward to our discussion. So enough of me talking, let's jump in with the experts here. So we are going to start with Dr. Malone. So question for you. So research during the pandemic shows that students with disabilities have experienced a number of educational challenges, such as lack of access to supports and services and decreased attendance during virtual instruction, just to name a few. In many cases, these persistent learning gaps and lack of support resulted in students with disabilities falling even further behind compared to their non-disabled peers. So based on your work, what are some examples you can share with us today of evidence-based practices educators can incorporate to ensure students with disabilities succeed now that schools have returned to in-person learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, this question could be a webinar in and of itself. So I just want to highlight the complexities that we have to think about when considering this question. And of course, like you said in the question, our students have really experienced quite a few learning challenges, and these gaps are going to persist if we don't intervene quickly. So I want to highlight just a couple of things within this area. So first and foremost, we really need to ensure that our teachers have adequate support so that they can really focus in and hone in and provide the depth of instruction that's required to fill in the learning gaps that many of our students are still experiencing. So I want to highlight something that we talk about consistently when we're developing curriculum and focusing on improving outcomes for our students, is focusing in on high leverage practices for students served under Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So just a little bit about background about what high leverage practices are, and I have a feeling that this is going to overlap a little bit with Sarah's talk as well, because her work really parallels what this is. So the Council for Exceptional Children and the Cedar Center at the University of Florida developed a set of best practices for teachers to thread throughout their teaching, really is an anchor to support learning across content areas. So the reason I want to highlight this is, like I said, this question could span an entire webinar, and we could go into each individual content area and really hone in and focus on what's required to move the needle for our students. But this set of practices is something that you can apply here and now across content areas. So I want to highlight these pillars of collaboration, assessment, social emotional learning and support, and instruction. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on instruction in a minute, but I want to provide a high-level view of what each of these things are. So in terms of collaboration, and I'm mindful of time as well, so just let me know. It's imperative that we collaborate across educators, parents, and caregivers to ensure everyone understands students' goals and expectations. So we know that developing community in the service of students is really imperative to drive student success. I want to highlight, I just completed a really wonderful interview with someone, an expert in the field, Dr. Temple Lovelace, for another event. She highlighted one bright spot that she has seen consistently throughout the pandemic was this forced integration of all responsible parties to ensure that our students received the support that they needed. So there was consistent communication, and that was one area that we actually learned a lot during the pandemic, that if we can communicate across parties in a way that drives success, that hopefully that we can start to move the needle. The second pillar of these high leverage practices is assessment. So it's imperative that we use multiple sources of information to really understand our students' strengths and use this assets-based approach to develop innovative approaches to drive success. We also need to focus on student social and emotional learning and their well-being so that we can ensure that we are maintaining respectful learning environments, focusing on student mental health as a way to support their learning during this time. And then the last area or pillar is a focus on instruction. And again, this is a deep area, and this is the area that I'm passionate about and where I want to center my discussion. So we need to identify and prioritize our long and short-term learning goals. And within this, in order to drive student success, we need to prioritize standards in a way that allows us to focus on depth rather than breadth. So I just want to highlight one example within that point, and I know we're going to move on to the next question. Achieve the Core developed something called coherence mapping. So the idea of coherence mapping, and they developed this specifically in math, and that is my area, so I apologize if that's my example. But basically the idea is that all of the standards throughout our grades are inherently related to each other. But there are specific standards that require greater depth because they're going to consistently come up throughout students' experience as they go grade to grade. And so it's within this, and I urge you to go to their website, we're highlighting the importance of the most salient standards that are going to drive student learning down the line. So for example, we need to ensure that students understand one-to-one numerical principles before we expect them to add. So that is, and not standard per se, but that is an area that we need to focus depth on, develop conceptual understanding before we can move on to more difficult concepts. So I'm going to stop there. Again, that could be a whole webinar, and I know that you have another question.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Those interesting findings are very helpful for framing and then also level setting for us today. I believe those remarks did that well. So thanks so much. And you mentioned some of what happened during the pandemic here. So as the country continues to recover from the pandemic, how important are professional development opportunities for special educators right now? And what type of professional development opportunities do these teachers need most in order to help students succeed?
Another great question. So we really need to focus our efforts on both efficient and effective professional development. Our teachers are incredibly burned out. The reason I wanted to mention high leverage practices in the last question is that we need to focus on developing teachers' knowledge of these strategies and principles that they can integrate throughout their content areas, so that they're not going to individual professional development sessions, learning little tidbits about each of these content areas and strategies to improve single standards-based approaches. Instead, we need to adequately support our professionals so that they are prepared across the board. We know that professionals learn best when they have multiple opportunities to respond, just like their students. They receive feedback on their performance, and they receive support in analyzing and improving their performance. So again, it's this consistent balance between content and practice. So one area that I think it's imperative that we focus on is driving the bridge between research and practice, and training teachers on evidence-based practices and specific tutoring programs that they can use and integrate into their classroom right now. So one example that was created and developed by my colleagues at Vanderbilt University, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, is called peer-assisted learning strategies. It's an evidence-based peer-mediated instructional program that has been studied and evaluated across, I think, 35 years across a range of randomized control trials. So PALS provides a framework for integrating positive peer interactions with intensive practice, both in reading and math. So if we're focusing our efforts with professional development on these areas, that teachers can use, again, across content areas, I think that would help prevent this consistent level of burnout and help our teachers really hone in on what's important to fill in those gaps.
Well, thank you for that. We will certainly try to capture these recommendations and key takeaways as well. Great suggestions. Thanks so much. And just as a reminder to our audience, you can please submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen as they come up, and we will move to those questions towards the end of the session. So moving to a question for you, Commissioner Fonte Green. So Rhode Island's education plan details how the districts will use funds to ensure students with disabilities have access to the resources they need to succeed. Can you please tell us more about the specific strategies and programs that you've utilized to get there during your time as State Commissioner?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that are really important that we've put in place, and some of them at the beginning stages and some of them are more fleshed out. And I want to say that this is an area that I've been trained in, and I've been blessed with a son who's on the autism spectrum. So it keeps me engaged in a very different way in this work. But as we start thinking about, we've created a blueprint for our differently abled students. That's what we call them in Rhode Island. We think language matters. We know about the legality, but they all have these different abilities, and that's what we're trying to align to and bring out. So we've created this framework working with West Ed and the National Center for Systemic Improvement to really lay out what the expectations are in the at the district level and in the classroom. What is the framework around that? And we worked with not just educators, but also parents and students to make sure that we captured all aspects of it. So we are going to get ready to release it one last time for public feedback, but that's going to be our North Star in doing this work. And when you introduced me, you mentioned the LEAP task force. And one of the things that was really important for the LEAP task force was a lot of what Dr. Malone mentioned is very similar to what we've put in place and having those pillars. But I think one of the most important ones for us was really calling out this population in a very distinct way. Because, if we say instruction for all, yes, that's great. But what does it mean for this population? Where's the focus? Where's the attention? What does the professional development look like? And I think that's where I feel like we are beginning to gain some traction, because we're not doing a lot of the one-offs. So we're getting training on obviously the standards, but also everybody's learning reading. How do you unpack it? What does it look like if you're this type of child that has this type of need or learns this way? What does that look like? So we have something which is called the Writing to Read Act, which is basically Orton Gillingham or the Science of Reading, so that every single teacher is trained K to 5, not just teachers that work with this population, because what we're trying to do is make sure that we have an integrated approach to everything that we do. It's not relegated to a subset of teachers, but that everybody feels the support and has the tools, because I think every teacher wants to be able to do these things. But I think that the tools that we have been supporting the teachers with have not been sufficient. And in our recovery document, our LEAP, accelerated learning, is how do we make up for the time that has been lost, and what does that look like? So it's the academic, but the social emotional piece of this is extremely important, especially for our students that may not have had a lot of in-person experience. We in Rhode Island have been in person the entire time. We only went out for 3 months, but there was there were different opportunities, and it happened differently in different places in terms of what kind of services. And I think for this population, parents were very worried about the pandemic. So how do we integrate, the academic piece and the different ways that students learn, but the social emotional as well? The social aspect of that, we cannot leave out, because I think all students have been impacted, but teachers don't necessarily have the training to really support the students where they are. And that's something that we are also doing, is providing that. We've provided training for all our teachers. We've worked with Yale University to provide online courses, 10 hours, that everyone that works with our students, from teachers assistants to teachers, how do we really work, and how do we create a school community that wraps around the needs of the students, especially in these social emotional aspects. The other piece that has really been integral for us to move forward has been creating these communities that really address individual needs, because as we know, our students are all different, and one of the issues that we have always had is really supporting the teachers that have students with most significant needs. They're always sort of left out of the equation. And we've created these collaboratives for different needs to bring them together so that teachers, once they stay in the profession, they get the supports that they need based on what they need, not what we think they need, but really what does that professional development look like? And that's created by these groups that we have formed during the pandemic, but all of it anchored on academics and also screening. What does the screening look like? So we have mandated throughout the state screening for all of our students so that we are really grounded on their individual needs and what are the right screening tools and what do we do with that information? And that's where we are. And that's the professional development that's taking place right now to support our teachers, because everyone's talking about tutoring, everybody's talking about the same things that we need, but it's going to be meaningless if we do more of the same. At least in Rhode Island, we were not in a good place to start off with this population. And then we have a large intersection of differently able students and multilingual learners that we have not really concentrated a lot of our efforts on. And that's part of our thrust this year, is really looking at this population. And the other piece that really has little to do or a lot to do with what happens in the classroom is that we've brought in our superintendents to talk about disaggregating the data by population and really supporting these populations and the teachers with their money, because it's always sort of an afterthought, and not just with IDEA dollars, but just with all dollars. So it has to be a very comprehensive approach. And if this is where the need is, the greatest need, then we need to supply the teachers and support the teachers with the professional development. So this is a very keen focus that we have in Rhode Island right now, and we can share some of that information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm hearing themes of the importance of community as well as addressing teacher burnout, of course. And I know that disaggregation of data has also been a key topic at the Hunt Institute recently. So can't understate that, certainly. So I think you already alluded to some of my next question, but can you share any more with us about who are the key partners who have been helping Rhode Island school districts to drive this work forward?
Sorry, I put myself on mute. So our key partners, we've also been working cross agencies. So the Department of Labor and Training have become very much our partners across the board, not at the end, but like, what does this look like? The Office of Rehabilitation Services to strengthen transition programs, they are our key partners. And then we have interagency commitments. So we're working with higher ed. We're also working with the governor's office, workforce office. So we are working with all these partners to make sure that we have all of the services really put together. And we have many, many, many. I could list some of the partners that, all of the partners that we have, but it would be an exhaustive list. Rhode Island takes this very seriously. But one of the things that has been really important for us is working with the communities and the partners. There's no way that we're going to do this by ourselves. There is no way. And our teachers are very dedicated. But I think that with the different collaborations and the different agencies, the good thing about my role is that I work with all of government. And I know that's not easy. And some of you may be nodding your heads like, oh yeah, we do it the best we can, and we do it in the best interest of the students. So we work with anyone that is going to bring us resources and provide the support that we need. And those are some of the agencies that we have put forth, but we have a very active parent group in Rhode Island that really pushes forward. And I will say that we work across sectors. And that means our public schools and our private schools. So that doesn't happen everywhere. And So that's something that we're really proud of, is all those supports that are in place. Obviously, we can have much more. We can do a lot more work, and but it is definitely part of the work that we're committed to doing.
Well, great. Thank you for that. I know that the higher ed team here at the Hunt Institute has been able to do some great work with Commissioner Shannon Gilkey. So it sounds like there's some statewide work going on there. So thank you for sharing the work that you're doing in Rhode Island and speaking to the student teacher perspective as well as the power partnerships in improving educational outcomes for Rhode Island students and beyond. So moving to you, Sarah, with the Ability Challenge. So the Ability Challenge supports schools and educators to ensure that every child, especially those with disabilities, those who are differently abled, Commissioner, thank you for that language. So it's supported by a collaborative educator team with the knowledge, skills, and tools needed to meet their unique learning needs. So based on your work, what professional development opportunities or other interventions do you think are key in supporting educators in their efforts?
Oh, good question. First of all, let me say thank you for having us here, having me here, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with my colleagues. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's listening. And please ask questions, because that's what makes these conversations so interesting. I also just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what the Ability Challenge does and the approach that we take, because I think it's adds some perspective to the answer to the question, which is what are the professional development skills? And so our vision is that we really want to see a future where schools and districts are centering the students who are most at the margins, like students with disabilities, in every policy, every practice that they take on, so that all children are on track to graduate from school ready to thrive and empowered to take on the world in whatever way that shape and form that is for every student, right? And we take that, it's a bit of a different approach to traditional special education reform or improvement, because we really believe at the heart of what we do that if we can meet the needs of our most diverse learners, then we're going to help everybody succeed. And so that's the lens that we take in our work with our partners. And we use the principles from research in order to support the work that we do. And so we use, for example, the high leverage practices that Dr. Malone was talking about. We really focus on the collaboration one, but we do work on all of them. And we believe that collaboration is one of the missing pieces, and that too often special educators and general educators are operating in silos. And so it's really important that we get folks together. There is a ton of expertise in our buildings. Everybody is talking about educator burnout, but we have to be really smart about how we're bringing the conversation together so that everybody's working together to maximize that expertise. And so when we do work, we work with all members of the school community, not just special educators, because many students are spending the majority of their time sitting in a classroom that's being taught by a general educator, and it's imperative that they also have the skills and knowledge to be able to support students. And so we take that approach, and we love working with special educators. We also love working with people who are not special educators. We also love working with leaders, because a lot of times there's a big leadership learning curve to really be able to support this kind of sort of mindset and culture shift that we're looking to achieve. So on that note, we have a set of competencies that are aligned to the high leverage practices that we use in our training, but they're very much sort of aligned to the work that the other frameworks that are out there sort of work on with this different lens. And so when we think about what are the competencies that we want our leaders and teachers to have, we have a set of 8 leader competencies and 8 teacher competencies that come out of the research. For example, one of the leader competencies is inclusive culture. And that is basically that leaders set and hold staff accountable for bold, clear, inclusive vision and aligned practice. And it's really important that accountability to meeting the vision is there, because it's one thing to set the vision and it's another thing to understand as a leader, these are the things that I'm going to do to make sure that people are living by the vision and that they're understanding the vision and making decisions about that vision, right? Another big one that's sort of more traditional in the special ed world is building family partnerships. And this is one where, I think we've spent a lot of focused time during COVID talking about really building effective partnerships, and schools that thrived during COVID, if we can say anyone thrived, but really spent a lot of time building reciprocal relationships with families that were centered on empathy and cultural competence. And I think those are really, really important skills when you think about professional development that need to be brought out. And then in the non-traditional world, we look at curriculum. How are leaders choosing curriculum, implementing curriculum? How are they helping teachers understand that you have to plan for specialized instruction, but you also have to be able to differentiate off the cuff? And then things like student support systems, right? What are the ways in which students who need more supports or more intervention are going to be able to be identified and supported in a positive way? So all of those are things that we're really focusing on and seeing as urgent needs right now for professional development across the board when it comes to the summer training. Just a few things to do during the summer.
Just a few during your summer break, right?
Yes.
Well, again, hearing the theme of a holistic approach to this work, certainly. So thank you for that. And what kinds of outcomes have the educators you've worked with seen from working with the Ability Challenge?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a lot of educators and leaders really focusing on outcomes that are related to our competencies, and specifically walking away feeling really empowered and optimistic, which is something that we don't see enough of, honestly, when we when we come to these partnerships, is a feeling that educators are going to come to training and come to opportunities for improvement and walk away saying, like, I understand what is needed and I feel empowered to be able to do that. That's one of the things. So we had a partnership where we had a teacher who was like just so burnout, and she came to the first session and she was like frowning. You could tell she was on Zoom, but she wasn't really there. And there were like a million things going on in the classroom, right? And she was the critic. And so it was like, this is our opportunity to change her mindset. And by the end of the year of working with her, she was asking, well, when do we meet again? And we had to tell her, like, take a break. It's the summer, like we'll be back in the fall. But it was really an opportunity to see that optimism and the sense of possibility reignited, which was really cool. And then in terms of outcomes, we are seeing folks looking at really building self-efficacy. If you look at the data, we sort of distinguish the lagging indicators, the things like student outcomes that take a really long time to change, right? And then there's the leading indicators, things that are indicative in the research of improving outcomes, but might be a little bit faster to look at. And so we build self-efficacy in our teachers because that's one of the things that they report, not feeling like they can support students in the classroom. And if you look at the data, it says if they have self-efficacy, if they feel that feeling, that does lead to improved outcomes. So that's one big one. And then the other one is a feeling of belonging for students, which is another indicator that leads to more positive outcomes. So those are some of the big ones. And then the last one that we are seeing is creation of systems that are sustainable and flexible at the same time. And so when we think about like behavior management is one that's been coming up a lot this year. And we have research that says that multi-tiered systems of support work, right? And so it is a matter of helping folks figure out what do we have that we can build on and turn into a really effective system. How do we measure that? How do we know it's working? And then how do we understand the difference between a multi-tiered system of support, which is sort of like a way of improving, of raising the frequency or intensity of a particular intervention, depending on the student's need, and special education, because oftentimes those two are seen as very different systems. And it's important that schools understand how to integrate those things into one. And I used a lot of jargon and technical terms. So if people have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we can get into any of those things.
I appreciate that. I have plenty of questions, but I won't get in the way here. So that is great, though. And thank you for making the connection between teacher self-efficacy and perhaps improved outcomes when it comes to the burnout that we've been speaking of here today. So I appreciate you sharing your experiences, the important work the Ability Project is doing to support schools delivering this dynamic special education programming to students. So thanks so much. And before we move on to the Q&A, I'd actually like to ask a follow-up question of each of our panelists, but also want to remind the audience to please drop any questions you might have in the chat feature for the Q&A part of today's session. So this question will be for all three of our panelists today. As we've discussed so far, supporting students with disabilities or who are differently able, Commissioner, I'm trying to adopt the language, I really am, will require coordinated efforts and partnerships between government, education, and the private sector, especially as we aim to meet federal requirements as outlined by the federal government. So from each of your perspectives and experiences, how can these sectors work together to ensure access to these opportunities for traditionally underserved student populations? So Commissioner, let's start with you.
I mentioned a little bit about the other interagency supports that we've been working together. And what we've done that is a little different than what we've done in the past because of the pandemic is we have a lot of forced innovation. And so working with the Department of Labor and Training and working with the other offices in state government, but also we launched our professional network for educators to support students with more complex needs and the different needs, but we all work together. So it is about sitting down with all these agencies and these different organizations and identifying building these paths for our students and what are the kinds of supports that we need in place. And I'm sort of joking, that is such a difficult task for state agencies because we are a bureaucracy and we get in our own way. And what the pandemic has taught us is that we could actually mobilize and move pretty quickly when we need to. So we have maintained a lot of these committees that we created during the pandemic for long-term systems and structures to be put in place. So all of them have a responsibility now. It's not just the Department of Education for our students and professional development and different opportunities, as well as financial support. So we're asking all the different offices to allocate funding that will meet the needs of the teachers, the students, and the parents. So that's something that we've done a little differently with all of our Department also of Human Services. I know it may not sound like it's a big deal, but it is because we also have to support the families along with the students. And this is a place where we have found that it was very needed to have that collaboration along with our teachers. Usually we just speak to the agencies, but we have the teachers and parents in the room having those conversations and really unpacking the needs. It's sometimes not appreciated when state level people make decisions for people on the ground for their needs. So we have decided to go bottom up and top down together and meet in the middle. And I think that is a new way for us. So we're still working out some of the kinks, but we're committed to continuing to work this way as we move forward.
Great, thank you. And thank you for emphasizing the importance of parent engagement, of course, too. So thanks so much, Dr. Malone. Turn to you now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm hearing a lot of talk about the continuous focus on community and engagement. And we hear this term innovation quite a bit, and we've heard that a lot coming out of the pandemic. And really what I think that is that word keeps coming up for us is that we had to move so quickly to adequately address the needs of our students in a way that we've never done before, that it really highlighted some unfortunate sources of disproportionality. And we had to, again, innovate really, we weren't doing anything new. We were actually just talking. We were driving communication across the line. So what the commissioner is highlighting is we need to kind of flip our approach and realize that we need to consider the needs of our students first. So if we center our efforts really on equity and inclusion and not consider this like this or that or the one-to-one orientation of services and supports, we can try our best to reimagine a world focused on equity. So that's a world where every student receives what they need exactly when they need it, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, class, disability status, and the like. And that's really what we're talking about. But in order to get there, we have to cross-collaborate. We have to speak. And that's a very difficult thing to do, as you just pointed out, because we work in our silos. So understanding and recognizing the importance of communication, I think, is the number one area there. Of course, there are policies that we can change, increase funding, increase collaboration, and the like. Again, that's for another webinar because we could go on and on about those needs there. But I think also another point that I want to mention that the pandemic really highlighted, again, access issues across our nation. But it also taught us about resilience, it taught us about grit, and it taught us about what we need to do to recenter our focus on our students. So again, I just want to end with it's imperative that we tie across government, education, across the private sector, so that we're really focusing on inclusive research and development. And I want to use that word inclusive very specifically there. I want to ensure that we are thinking about the needs of students in the general education classroom, as well as the needs of students with disabilities. We need to integrate best practices across the board. I want to highlight that I'm seeing in the chat, and I know that there's very specific questions, but a continuous thread in some of these questions is, how can we ensure that we are delivering these practices that Sarah and myself have highlighted, that we identify as evidence-based or best practices within our field, when we are consistently pressed for time? And that's something that we are all working, we're all pressed for time, right? But I think, like we're saying, if we communicate across the board consistently and build that pattern of success, it's going to be easier and more natural for all of us to build those high leverage or best practices within our classrooms, within our systems, within government, and the like. That's a hope. And that's a recommendation. But I think a lot of us are working toward that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Malone. And I think your point about centering equity and inclusion in this work and really the policymaking process as well, and the efficacy that can come out of that, I think is another one that needs to be captured in our key takeaways from today. So thanks so much. Sarah, I'll turn to you then for the same question.
All right. Well, I get the privilege of just saying, and ditto. But I will take my lens is always like an on the ground, sort of like what's happening in the school building. So I'll answer that question with that lens to say maybe something a little bit contrary to what I just said about the importance of collaboration, because I think it is very important, very important that we realize that interagency and sort of interdepartment collaboration is intentionally separated, because there are very real privacy issues that need to be respected. And so when we think about building systems, I am all for collaboration as long as we are empowering parents and students to be in charge of their own data. And especially when it comes to students with disabilities, I think that's really important. And so when I think about building more collaboration across different partners to meet the needs of students better, I think about the like technical solutions, right? How do you make sure that families and children are consenting in a way that's really authentic, and that they know what they're consenting to? And then things like scheduling, which you would think are not that big of a deal, but are huge when it comes to that. teachers are in a school classroom for their work, almost all of their working hours, right? And so if you want to have, like, if it's a child who's involved in maybe correctional setting or something else that's not school related, and you want to have a meeting with everybody, even just finding a time to do it is really tough. So those are real challenges that need to be addressed, both from a policy perspective and also operations. And then I think the last thing is the adaptive support, right? Like figuring out how we get shared learning opportunities so we can build a common language across different populations is really important. And maybe even thinking about like some big goals that can be shared so that different agencies and different initiatives are moving in the same direction, even with a different lens. And so those are a couple of the things that I think of. For me, this really has become very clear in all of the different tutoring initiatives that have come up, and just making sure that with everyone who's going into tutoring roles who maybe weren't trained as teachers, they have a basic understanding of what is disability and how does it manifest in learning, right? So you're sitting with a child, you might know what you're supposed to be reading with them, but if you don't know that the child that has ADHD might have trouble sitting down, and maybe you should be reading with them standing up, or maybe you should be walking down the hallway, right? Like there's all these strategies. But if you're a tutor and you've never done that before, you need to know some of that, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that's coming up a lot for me these days, is how do we make sure that there is a shared knowledge and understanding and language when it comes to meeting the needs of all learners.
That's a really good point. I just want to say one more thing. We conducted a recent survey that suggested that only 17% of teachers felt that they were well prepared to teach students. And this is specific to learning disabilities. So I imagine it would be even lower for a wider range. And it just points out that we need to integrate the way that we prepare our teachers and really focus and hone in on that communication so that we can boost that factor.
That study was so good, by the way. Everyone who's listening should read it because it was really good.
I just want to add something to that. I'm sorry that Sarah said about the tutoring. One of the things in our LEAP report and what we've put out there is that there has to be collaboration between tutoring and the school and the teachers that teach the students. So it's not this separate entity where they're starting things over, and there has to be there's a data sharing agreement so that we have that ability, just like you said, because if a child has different ways of learning that have already been established in the classroom, they should have access to that with the tutoring. So that's one of the things that is really important. And with our blueprint for our differently able success really is very specific about the things that need to happen at the district level, what we're expecting to see. And part of that is giving the teachers the time to use the research-based practice in the classroom. Like, you know, we're sort of not, you know, we have a tendency in education to try the new and latest thing. And there's proven research practices that work. And that's what we want to see in the classroom, especially for this population, and especially for the teachers that work with them across the board, not just as special education teachers, but all the teachers. So that is our expectation. So that's where policy is very powerful.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the natural conversation coming out of today's discussion. So Dr. Malone, I think a few in the chat were wondering about the name of the study as well. So we'll have to be sure to share that with our audience after the session today, or if you want to drop it in the chat, please feel free. We are going to turn to the Q&A now. So we've been kind of collecting questions from the audience throughout today's session. And I believe, Sarah, there's one that's well tailored for you to speak to. So I would like to start with you. Yes. So how do you help teachers focus more on deep dives on key content when there's such a push to finish the curriculum by the end of the school year? I think that's a very practical concern to address.
I was so hoping that I was going to get to answer that question. So thank you.
Great.
We're channeling each other. That's a very real concern. And one of the things that we are finding ourselves spending a good amount of time doing, which is awesome, is helping school leaders prioritize initiatives and draw connections between the initiatives that they're working on to make sure that there's a natural overlap and a direction and a vision. And so there is the push to finish the curriculum. There's also the 75 different initiatives that are happening and the PLCs that you have to go to and the trainings and the this and the that and the IEP meetings, right? There's a million things going on. And sometimes it's harder to say, we're not going to do these 3 things, but we're going to focus on these 2. And so that's where we can help, and we do help our partners, is to say, how do we use data to make that decision? And how do we say to the community, just because we're not focusing on these 3 things doesn't mean they're not happening. It just means that we're developing priorities in a way that aligns with the school that we want to be, or the district that we want to be, or the state that we want to be, right? And I think that can help people realize that you can go deeper on certain content and still build a breadth of knowledge, right? Just because you're focusing on something like using data to make instructional decisions, it doesn't mean that you're not also focusing on how to make sure that kids are moving forward in the curriculum, right? You have to have data in order to be able to do that really well, to know when to reteach or pre-teach or, use a different strategy. It's a lot easier though for me to say that right now than it is for a teacher who's trying to figure out how to do all of those things at once. And so I think part of that really is a leader saying, these are the priorities and this is what we're going to get behind as a school community. And these are the things that we're not going to do. And here's why.
Well, you're really talking about changing the culture to focus on, those practices that will actually move our students forward.
Yeah.
And I dropped in the report, I think the Hunt Institute did as well. It's called Forward Together, and it's on page 11, the stat I was referencing.
Great. Thanks so much for taking care of that. And thanks, Sarah, as well, for that feedback on the first question. And I'd also like to move to a policy-oriented question with the commissioner, or maybe just from a state perspective. How do we make services more inclusive and less exclusive? That also came from the chat. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that we've sort of been answering that question, and it is about, what is the policy? What are the expectations that we're setting up? And that's why having this big umbrella of this is what we expect to come out of the districts, and these are the practices that we expect to see. And it's not obviously lockstep, because it doesn't make sense to do that, but we want to make sure that the practices are research-based. We know that what we've been, there's certain areas that all teachers can benefit from, not, because our kids sit with all sorts of teachers. So what of those things? And I keep going back to this blueprint because it is a framework for the state in terms of curriculum, in terms of assessment, in terms of instructional practices, and then allocation of funds and resources. And the time that the district staff spends on this population of students or differently able students, for a long time, it's been relegated to the special education staff only, or the special education world. And it can't be, right? It just can't be, because we're perpetuating these silos. And what we're trying to do is break down the silos from the top down and bottom up, where we're saying this is the expectation for the state of Rhode Island. And I think it was Sarah who said, we're not going to have 27 different things that we're going to look at the things that make sense. And how do we drive that with our Right to Read Act? What are we doing? What are the things that make sense that we're going to put in place? And how does that connect to what's happening in the classroom, the curriculum, the data, and all of that together? That's the work that we have been doing, but have to go deeper. We don't have it all figured out, but I think that we are in a good place. We're poised to do that. And the second piece that I think we have spent a great deal of time and used some of our data, we have something called Survey Works that we send out to all teachers, all parents in our system. And we have questions in particular for parents that have differently abled students. What, how's your child growing? Is your child progressing? Do you see this? Are the needs being met? What are the tools that you have been given as a parent? Do you have a voice? I think we engage parents during an IEP process and not much else. And I think that that's a shift for us. I'm an educator, but I go through the IEP meetings and I'm like a deer in headlights. It's a very complicated process, but also that can't be the process or the way to engage the parents. And I think for a long time that has been a singular way. And so we have included parents in a very strategic partnership in the work that we're doing by actually even just asking them statewide, what are the needs? What are they seeing? What is working well in their schools, in their districts, and in their classrooms? And what kind of communication and partnership are they receiving from the districts?
Thank you for that. I think it's very powerful to ask the parents directly instead of others speaking for the parents, certainly. So thanks for providing those remarks. And I also want to go back to Dr. Malone, speaking from kind of a research perspective here. So to create and maintain high quality professional development opportunities for special educators. So of course, robust data systems are needed to measure progress and outcomes. So how can schools evaluate student success in the classroom and beyond once special educators are back in the classroom this fall? And also if you have thoughts on what sort of longitudinal measures can be used to evaluate the long-term success of both teachers and students moving into the new school year.
Yeah, no, very good question. I think that we need to think collectively about what data we're collecting and how it is efficiently driving instruction. So first and foremost, we need to be really cognizant of the fact that we need to conduct consistent formative assessments that are not only assessing students' academic needs, but also their social, emotional, and well-being needs as well, so that we can consistently have this holistic picture of what is driving student success, what is driving potential gaps, so that we can fill in those gaps as we move forward through the curriculum, as we move forward throughout the school year, in order, again, to support our students. And just keep in mind that as we assess our students day after day, week after week, things change on a dime. And it's important that we not only do these formal assessments, which, a formative assessment can range from a reliable and valid curriculum-based measurement to simply assessing students' knowledge in the moment. But we need to be cognizant that day by day, week by week changes can really dramatically impact the way that we address our students and the way that we address our curriculum. And we need to think critically about how our teaching measures interact with performance on particular assessments. In terms of thinking about longitudinal measures, of course, we have our long-term standardized assessments that our students take, but I think that we need, this goes back to my kind of like inclusive research and development process. We need to kind of think creatively on how we are measuring student success. It's not just ticking off a box. I scored in the X percentile on this particular assessment, but did my student grow across the range of their goals and different areas across academic content, as well as their behavioral goals and the like. So critically thinking about the assessment piece, again, across the range of the entire student rather than just a single time point. Again, that could be an entire webinar as well, and I know that we're out of time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. As someone with a background in higher education assessment, I will certainly be sharing some of those thoughts with my higher ed colleagues as well. So I know that we could use some work in the assessment field. So I wish we keep the conversation going. And I know that a lot of webinar topics came out of today's webinar. So we are at about time, but I want to thank each of you, of course. Not only your expertise, but your passion for this area really came out today, and I appreciate that sincerely. So Commissioner Infante Green, Sarah, Dr. Malone, thanks so much. And before closing today's discussion, I want to turn everyone to our upcoming K-12 discussions. Our next webinar will be next week on Thursday, June 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be discussing the importance of developing clear pathways and supports for a more diverse school leadership pipeline. So we'll go ahead and drop the registration link to that webinar in the chat. We also encourage you to join us on July 21st to hear about how and why teachers leaving the profession in such large numbers, and then how policymakers can stem the tide. And on August 4th, we will also be learning more about using our funding to support innovative approaches to education. So you can register for these discussions, of course, by going to our website, and we'll also be in touch via email and social media in the coming days and weeks regarding registration. So thanks again so much to our panelists. We hope to see you again and partner again in the future, and we hope to see you all again soon. So take care.